Forgebreaker. The three friends watched the train vanish slowly into the rain-shrouded mist. "I shall return to the forge," Phyrexian said at last. The other two exchanged glances. Then, without words, Cuthhelm waved off the seers, who turned and began the slow ascent back toward the Holmbiorg, their robes whispering against the wet cobblestones. Beside him, Tunbald gave a simple gesture, and the honor guard of cadets fell into formation. They marched off in silence, their destination the Weezer Academia, the training ground of the Void Revenants. "We will accompany you," Cuthhelm said. The three men fell into step, walking down the wide road that wound toward the vast silhouette of the great forge, nestled beneath the watchful gaze of the Holmbiorg. Rain pattered steadily on steel and stone, and steam coiled in the distance like ghosts retreating from the firelight. "It's been a long time since I came here," Phyrexian said, his tone casual, an attempt at conversation, though the weight of memory pressed behind every word. The great forge loomed ahead of them, a black mountain of steel and fire stitched into the base of the Holmborg like a wound that refused to close. Rain fell in steady sheets, running off its sloped armor plates in thick rivulets. Steam bled from vents and chimneys, coiling into the night sky like smoke from a sleeping beast. High above, the wan moon glimmered through the clouds, casting a pale light over the industrial colossus. Lightning rods and sensor pylons jutted out like horns from its upper decks, and the rhythmic clank of internal machinery echoed from deep within, the sound of something ancient still working after too many wars. It was more than a forge. It was a relic. A standard template constructor, barely understood even by the Adeptus Mechanicus that worshipped it. Its outer shell had been expanded and rebuilt over centuries, but its core still pulsed with mechanisms designed in ages lost to time. Buried beneath its vast foundations were the lower vaults, sealed chambers that now housed the newly sanctified Voidworks, where armor, weapons, and relics for the Void Revenants were forged beneath cogwheel frescoes and burning censers. The forge itself was ringed by defensive bastions, bunker blocks with sloped ferrocrete walls and shielded hatches. One such pillbox, overlooking the road from the station, came into view as the three men approached. A pair of Mechanicus guardsmen stood at attention beneath the overhang, robes soaked and rifles glinting with rain. One stepped forward and gave a crisp salute. Tunbald returned it wordlessly. They passed through without breaking stride, moving past a Skitarii patrol, red-cloaked sentinels with photonic eyes and polished galvanic rifles. Their augmetics hissed softly in the cold. One of them, an alpha, gave a slow nod of recognition to Cuthhelm, who nodded back. The familiarity was mutual. These men had bled in the same campaigns once. Ahead, the outer gate opened, parting with a hydraulic groan that echoed through the stone pass. Phyrexian glanced up toward the hollow-lit cogitator screens above the gate, their green runes flickering through the rain. "I remember when that gate was blown out during the siege of the Red Walk," he said, his voice low but edged with quiet pride. "Took us a week to reclaim this sector." Tunbald grunted. "Longer to cleanse it." Cuthhelm walked beside them, eyes forward. "Still standing, though. Not many things do." Steam rolled out from within the forge as they crossed the threshold, enveloping them in warmth tinged with machine oil and incense. Phyrexian led them deeper along the forge road, gesturing proudly as he explained the intricacies of the machine works. "The upper chimneys feed directly from geothermal ducts beneath the Holmbiorg," he said, pointing to a venting tower, steam billowing into the rain. "And here, this conduit feeds the fabrication tiers, the ones we rebuilt with the Skitarii of Fiskbola. You'll see the new glyph-locked pressure gates, custom designed to hold in case of another internal pressure surge." Tunbald, however, wasn't listening. He glanced up at the towering shape of the forge, its surface glistening in the rain. As a boy, he remembered sailing past it on his father's fishing boat, watching it belch steam into the sky, struck dumb by its size, its complexity, its age. Now it loomed far closer, far darker. Cuthhelm, for his part, remembered the forge differently. From atop the Holmborg, as a young seer, he had looked down upon it with suspicion. Machines built by the men of old, forgotten knowledge. He trusted instead in the warp, his gift. Not the relics of a vanished age. They came to a halt beside a massive adamantium door, its edges glowing faintly with runes of sanctification. These led to the lower vaults, Phyrexian said, resting one hand against the bulkhead with pride. This was where we set up the Revenant armories. I had the old seal doors melted and reforged myself, 8 tons each, built to hold. Tunbald wasn't listening. He was scanning the shadows, the steam, the gutters. His fingers crept down, brushing the handle of his warg-headed bolter. Cuthelm turned to him, frowning. He too felt it. Wrongness. Something low and creeping. A pressure. Like a fog rising through cracks in the world. He listened, not with his ears, but in the warp. There it was, a shadow, unnoticed before, wrapping around the forge like a vine. "What's wrong?" Phyrexian asked, blinking behind his bionic lens. "I'm not sure," Tunbald murmured, voice low. Then he stopped, eyes narrowing. The rain had stopped. But only here, over this part of the forge. All around, he could still hear it falling, still feel the mist. But here, the air was still. He looked up. The sky was blank, flat, too flat, and then light. With a shriek, lance batteries fired from the empty sky. Beams of viridian and silver carved from nothing, mid-air, phasing into real space with horrific precision and smashed into the side of the forge. The blast lit the night like a second sun. Phyrexian staggered backward, shouting, but the roar drowned his voice. The gates to the lower vaults shuddered under the impact. Sirens began to wail. The sky above tore open, shards of something impossible flickering at the edge of vision. Tunbald realized all too late. The rain was not falling on them because a cloaked vessel was hovering silently above the forge. If they couldn't see it, the defense cogitators couldn't target it. Then came the roar. Macro-plasma cannons belched from the unseen warship, lancing down in incandescent fury. Men were vaporized, buildings torn apart in white-hot detonations. From the darkness, Drukhari Ravagers screamed overhead, their sleek forms emerging like nightmares. The pillbox they had passed earlier must have been manned by veterans. It opened fire immediately. But a lance beam carved through its armored shell, and the structure detonated in a plume of flame and debris. Drukhari warriors dropped from the skies, their splinter rifles blazing, cutting down Skitarii who desperately tried to form firing lines. Cuthelm raised his stave, blocking a searing plasma fusillade. He grabbed Phyrexian and pulled him beneath a smoking hover truck for cover. Tunbald raised his warg-headed bolter, snapping off rounds to cover them. His first 2 shots missed, too fast, too agile. He adjusted, aiming ahead of their movements. 3 more shots, 3 Xenos fell. The last warrior vaulted over him with inhuman grace, only to be decapitated by Cuthelm in a single sweeping arc of his force stave. "I don't think they like us," Cuthelm muttered, flicking ichor from the stave. Phyrexian stood, defiance etched into every line of his bionic frame. The forge must stand. The gates to the lower vaults, reinforced only months prior, were scorched and warped, but still intact. A Drukhari skimmer had descended, latching onto the doors with breaching talons. Beside it stood a towering figure in dark, finely etched armor, ebon black inlaid with pallid silver. He laughed as he cleaved down a group of charging Skitarii with a double-bladed glaive, the weapon a blur of death. At his sides floated 2 sorcerers, whether homunculi or some warp-tainted xenopsychers, shrouding the craft in a veil of kinetic force. Return fire from a bunker atop the Homborg ramparts splashed harmlessly against their shield. "We must protect the vault," Phyrexian shouted. More lance strikes hammered the upper levels of the forge. The void shield flickered, then collapsed. Explosions rippled through the structure like thunder in a bottle. Defensive macro batteries spat fire into the heavens, but their targeting systems could not lock on. Missiles spiraled aimlessly, detonating harmlessly or crashing into empty mountainside. Then the unseen ship shifted its aim. Lances burned across the sky toward the port of Wizir. "We have to force that ship to decloak," Tunbald said grimly, reloading his bolter. Cabalite machinist Valeth let out a piercing, mad laugh, an edge of mania in every breath. It had been too long since he'd tasted battle. Aeons spent overseeing the construction of Elfscathia had dulled the thrill, the joy of murder in motion. But here was life. A tech priest charged him, wielding a humming power staff with clumsy, righteous fury. Valeth barely moved, just a blur of speed the Adept's combat cogitator couldn't register. He reappeared behind the priest with a backhanded slash of his twin-bladed glaive, decapitating the man in one clean motion. He laughed again, fuller this time, intoxicated by the carnage. Before him lay the towering gates to the lower vault, still unbreached, but now unguarded. That simply would not do. Valeth tilted his head, studying the doors with the calculating eye of an artisan. The adamantium plates were ancient, layered with precision. Each stratum housed its own shielding matrix, barely the width of an atom, yet together as thick as battleship armor. He turned to the nearest Ravager. Its weapon systems, dark lances, splinter cannons, even void rippers, wouldn't be enough. A shame, but not unexpected. He clicked his Vox unit. Bring the sorcerers. Two tall, lithe figures drifted forward, robes billowing unnaturally as if stirred by unseen winds. Both were clones, crafted in the flesh vats of Eilith herself. Witches bred for psychic devastation, perfected reflections of their matron's will. These two, her younger daughters, were less refined than the primary heir, currently accompanying Eilith on another raid. Still, they would suffice. Valeth waved a clawed hand dismissively. Take that door down. It offends me. They bowed in eerie synchronicity. One turned her attention briefly to the surviving Skitarii forming up behind the debris field. With a flick of her wrist, a warp-infused lens unfolded before one eye. She cast a bolt of sorcerous light, an aimed volley that ruptured the flesh and steel of half a dozen Skitarii in an instant. Stop playing with them, Valeth snapped. We have work. Agitated now, he paced, clicking his claws on the ferrocrete as the twin psychers advanced on the vault. Together they chanted in the tongue of ancient Kamara, channeling raw empiric energy into the structure. The gates trembled, warp fields folded in on themselves, refracted and collapsed. The adamantium strained, flexed, then buckled. With a thunderous groan, the entire gate assembly collapsed inward, pulverized from within. Valeth chuckled darkly. That will do. Now, go play. The sorceresses turned and leapt into the smoke, vanishing toward the upper gantries to hunt. Valeth stepped across the rubble. Before him lay the Manufactorum Vault, the last functional facility in the Arcana Inclusium capable of producing Space Marine warplate. He would see it broken, desecrated. His elite guard darted ahead into the shadows of the tunnel beyond, blades drawn. Destruction was only moments away. Calculus Logifexian watched in horror as the gates fell, his gates. Weeks of design, labor, and precise fabrication undone in a heartbeat. The new plating, the layered adamantium composites, the shielding lattice, crushed beneath warp-born sorcery and brute force. As the smoke cleared and the twisted metal groaned, he saw them. The twin sorceresses stepping over steaming piles of slumped servitors, accompanied by a cadre of heavily armored Drakari. That would not do. Phyrexian flicked his fingers in a blur of encoded battle sign toward Cuthhelm. Then he sent out a narrow-beam transmission from his internal cogitator relay. It consumed 62.6% of his total runtime processing power, but that was within acceptable parameters. The message pulsed outward. Within the vault's shadowed passageways, the twin sorceresses glided forward, their movements unnatural, like silk flowing uphill. Their eldritch vision pierced the gloom with ease. Light was unnecessary. They could see every contour, every soul flicker in the black. Behind them moved a vanguard of Kabbalite guards, armored in lacquered plates, steps smooth as a dance. They marched 2 by 2, scanning the corridor ahead with contemptuous grace. The tunnel led deep beneath the great forge. The acrid stink of boiling metal, scorched carbon, and chemical solvent wafted up from the depths, the scent of human labor. One lone weapon servitor still functioned, its gun arm sparking as it attempted a firing lock. A flash of a curved blade silenced it mid-litany. The sorceresses laughed. The vaulted corridor was lined with bracing struts, oddly modern and reinforced. An observant eye might have seen the seams, but the intruders weren't looking. These supports were the facade of a deeper deception. Phyrexian, huddled behind the smoking ruin of a hover transport, smiled grimly. His mind was already inside the passage, eyes spread across multiple data feeds. The faux reinforcements were precisely constructed for this purpose. In a synchronized pulse, shaped charges detonated across both corridor walls. A plume of dust and rockcrete erupted. From within the false partitions, machines strode forth. They were towering battle automata, each over 3 meters tall, built from salvaged castellax and reconfigured to Phyrexian's personal specifications. Their limbs ended in fusion claws, grav cannons, or plasma incinerators. Some bore conversion beamers with unstable cores, unstable by design. The Drukhari staggered. Their arrogance had led them to expect resistance at the terminus of the vault, not from within its very bones. Phyrexian's grin widened. Subroutines engaged, he whispered through gritted metal teeth. The robots opened fire. The battle of the vault passage had become a slaughterhouse. Each of Phyrexian's war automata thundered forward through the gloom, their heavy limbs glinting with molten steel and phosphor sparks. Massive claws closed on Drukhari torsos with sickening finality, crunching through ceramite-like armor and snapping bones like dry wood. Splinter fire glanced off their reinforced frames, and even dark matter blasts only pitted the outer shell before another strike from a servo fist silenced the shooter. To Phyrexian, every blow struck felt like an echo in his own body. His connection to the war engines was deeper than command. He was them. When one automaton lost an arm to a sorceress's arcing scream of purple-edged warp fire, Phyrexian flinched beneath the burnt wreckage of the grav tank above. Sparks raked through his neural interface like nails across a cogitator coil. He tasted metal and ozone in the back of his throat, but even as the pain came, so too did the resolve. The sorceresses of the Drukhari danced through the corridor like ghosts, fire in one hand, razor fan in the other, hurling psychoactive illusions and devastating force against the steel tide. One turned a robot to molten slag with a burst of warp flame that carved burning glyphs into its frame, screaming curses older than human memory. But when she tried the same trick on the next, her spell cracked and died. Its surface was warded with a lattice of null matrix filigree and self-mutating runes keyed to banish her craft. Phyrexian's voice, sharp and mechanical, hissed through the vault's internal vox. You play at being gods. I built these machines with contingency layered upon contingency. Each one carries different wards, psychic refractors, and script breakers. You may kill one, but never the same way twice. The Drukhari forces reeled. As they tried to reform a line, they found themselves hemmed in against the very gate they had breached. Their sleek elegance turned frantic, blades flashing in desperation as war machines closed in from all sides. One Ravager pilot screamed for extraction over encrypted signal. Phyrexian intercepted it and sent false coordinates, and the extraction skiff was obliterated by a hidden macro battery moments later. The air reeked of boiling promethium and burnt Xenos flesh. The shadows danced with firelight and muzzle flashes, each step forward by the automata grinding shattered bodies into the floor. Time, what little the Drukhari ever had, was bleeding away, and Phyrexian, cold and wrathful, smiled inside his helm. The two sorceresses backed off, each step a reluctant retreat. For the first time in over a century, both felt something utterly alien to them, something no tormentor in the arenas of Elfscathia had ever inflicted. The creeping certainty that they were losing. Corenzo raised layered warp shields over her sister as Azirshi sent a thought needle slicing toward Valeth. Then she screamed aloud to the warriors, "Stop wasting time! Kill them!" The remaining Kabbalite guards surged forward, vaulting from wall mounts and flickering through shadow, graceful as vipers. But the machines were faster. Too fast. A warrior landed in front of a robot, then was pulped under a crashing power claw before his blade even rose. Another leapt from a lumen scaffold, only to fly straight into a beam of extreme radiation, his form blistering and shriveling inside armor that buckled from the heat. Azirshi narrowed her eyes. They should not be this fast. They should not adapt this quickly. A sudden realization dawned. She snarled in Drukhari tongue and fired a glowing orb into the air. Not a spell, not truly, but a device laced with stolen warp energy and psycho-cybernetic tracers. In Elfscathia, such orbs were used to hunt escaped prisoners or assassins who entered the tower through forgotten webway paths. The orb could trace both mechanical emissions and psychic imprints to their source. It shot from the vault like a shard of starlight. "Go," she ordered. Corenzo gave a wicked wink and vanished into motion, a streak of silk-wrapped lightning trailing the orb like a loyal hunting hound. Outside, Kabbalite machinist Valeth stood behind a low barricade of broken ferrocrete and corpse-mangled Scutaria, orchestrating the assault. Fire control orders flowed from his mind to the gunners of the hidden void ship overhead. He watched the orb speed away, eyes narrowing. It flew toward a burning grav tank. There were more bodies than expected here. His lenses focused. Then he saw it. Astartes. Not dead. A librarian crouched in the debris, Cuthhelm. Valeth smiled, something cold and alien flickering in his mind. He stepped forward, idly waving at a Ravager gunship's Reaper battery. Its weapon mount twisted toward the target like a beast scenting blood. Corenzo appeared at his side, gliding like silk poured over razors. "It wants to play," she purred. Valeth's smile widened as he replied, voice like a blade through parchment. "Then give it a game." Tunbald was halfway up the auxiliary stairs on the flank of the great forge. He had paused briefly to survey the battlefield. From this vantage, he saw a glowing orb of light shoot from the vault gates, now out of sight behind the forge's bulk, but he could estimate the trajectory. It hovered above a ruined grav tank near where Phexion and Cuthhelm were directing the defense. He grimaced inside his helm. Moments later, a Reaper-class Drakari skimmer slipped into view, gliding like a serpent through the smoke. They'd found the Resistance's command post. Scanning around, he spotted a squad of orange-robed Vanguard Skitarii gunning down the last of a raiding party near the upper forge gates. A Mechanicus tank trundled into position from the port side, its weapon ports glowing, but before it could fire, lances from the Reaper punched through its engine core in a plume of white-hot radiation. It detonated, throwing debris across the courtyard. Tunbald activated wideband Vox. Alpha Vanguard, move to protect Calculus Logifexion. All units receiving this signal converge on the vault. Then he vaulted from the stairwell, landing hard on a gantry beside the 5th-floor platform. The forge's upper landing pad was in flames. Shuttles and flyers burned, suppression foam hissing from shattered tanks and ruptured hoses. There was no hope of extraction from above. But the crane, the massive assembly crane, still stood, partially detached, the one used to install the new vault gates weeks prior. Tunbald sprinted along the winch housing. Below, the Reaper drifted sideways, maneuvering for a clean shot at the smoking grav tank where Phexion and Cuthhelm were dug in. He pulled a melta-charge from his belt, affixed it to a grapnel canister, and slotted it into his bolter's launcher. As he prepared to fire, a Drukari jet bike screamed into view and strafed his position, pink glowing shard discs peppering the parapet. He ducked behind a steel brace. The flyer circled wide to line up another pass. No time. He rolled from cover, braced the bolter, and fired. The grapnel sang through the air, the melta-charge detonating on impact. The base of the crane glowed, then liquefied, molten metal pouring like blood. With a grinding shriek, the crane collapsed sideways across the courtyard, crashing down atop the Reaper. The skimmer was split in two. Tunbald didn't pause to celebrate. He turned, snapped a few bolter rounds at the circling jet bike to keep its attention, then dropped to the next floor. The Xeno's pilot took the bait, igniting its thrusters in pursuit. Tunbald vanished into the internal gantries and steel arteries of the forge, leading the flyer deep into the labyrinthine heart of the manufactorum. Far below, Cuthhelm was bracing to engage the Drukari Reaper when he saw the crane land atop it, splitting the hull in two. The forward section buried itself deep in the mud, while the aft engine compartment spun wildly, tangled in pipes and support cables ripped down with the wreckage of the crane. The Drukari warriors nearby hesitated, confusion rippling through their ranks. Cuthhelm took swift advantage, firing a hail of ice shards that impaled two Xenos, then igniting two more in witchfire that turned their screams into shrill music of the damned. He moved back into cover, checking Phexion, who still sat behind the smoking grav tank, deep in trance, but grinning broadly. Cuthhelm shook his head, never quite understanding how Mechanicus magic worked. A squad of Skitarii Vanguard advanced rapidly toward their position, forming a defense line around the ruined tank. Cuthhelm gave them a curt nod and turned to seek the next threat. Off to the side, he noticed something strange. A pall of rain falling in sheets, yet none where he stood. He looked up through the smoke-filled sky and smiled coldly. Raising his staff, he planted its half deep into the sodden earth. Ice rippled outward in every direction, then climbed upward in sudden jagged towers. The rain above froze mid-air. Shards of ice formed, fanning outward and upwards, catching, clinging, outlining something vast. The warped architecture of an invisible vessel shimmered as frost outlined the hull of the Drukari warship, hovering just above them. He narrowed his eyes as a glint of power flickered within them. His irises turned luminous blue with witchfire. Drawing heat from the sky itself, Cuthhelm grounded the energy through his staff, lowering the temperature with punishing focus. Ice built rapidly along the flank of the cloaked vessel, until tons of frozen rainwater clung like leeches to its fuselage. The warship shuddered. Ice cracked and groaned across its hull. With a screech of failing anti-gravs, the ship dropped to one flank. And then, with the ice reflecting the battlefield's searchlights and muzzle flashes, the once hidden craft lit up like a beacon. Every gun on the field turned skyward and opened fire. The Drukhari vessel, once cloaked in shadow and gliding unseen through the storm-churned sky, now shimmered into visibility under the harsh glare of searchlights and the refracting glow of ice. Frozen sheets crusted its sleek blade-like hull, unnatural and jagged, a crown of frost summoned by Cuthhelm's sorcery. The ship's dark metal carapace groaned under the weight, hull plates buckling as blasts of psychic cold rooted deeper than the Xeno's gravimeters could compensate for. With a wrenching scream of stressed metal, the cloaking field finally collapsed. Shields sputtered and flickered in strobing flashes of violet and green as the surrounding defenders opened fire. Autocannon rounds, las beams, and defense lasers tore into the shimmering void ship, tearing gashes in its flanks. Chunks of armor broke free, tumbling downward, some massive enough to crush tanks, others laced with jagged ice like frozen shrapnel. Several slammed into the forge courtyard below, crushing Skitarii and Xenos alike in indiscriminate ruin. Then the engines detonated. A delayed chain reaction, ignited by residual shots from the Holmborg's rampart cannons, triggered deep within the starboard propulsion cluster. The Reaper-patterned vessel pitched sideways, its aft quarter tearing apart in a maelstrom of green plasma and black fire. Half the ship broke away in midair, tumbling end over end before it slammed into the cold sea between the forge promontory and the base of the Holmborg. Steam exploded upward in columns hundreds of feet high as molten hull and burning fuel hit the ice-slicked ocean. Fragments of glowing wreckage skipped and bounced across the waves before vanishing beneath. The bow of the ship, still barely intact, tilted downward and followed, ice-covered, trailing smoke, and still shedding dying sparks of power from exposed weapon mounts. It struck the surf in a deafening plunge, vanishing into the depths in a boiling, luminous cloud. In the sudden silence, only the crackling of fire and the distant sirens from the upper forges remained. Cuthhelm stood still for a heartbeat, frost still forming in a halo around his staff. Then, calmly, he turned toward the next threat. Tunbald moved like a shadow between the great forge's towering supports and massive gantries, weaving through labyrinthine mechanisms and hoppers of molten metal that thundered overhead on rail lines. The stench of promethium and scorched steel filled the air, and every piston thump echoed like the pulse of a god machine. Behind him, the shriek of thrusters and the whispering hum of a Drukhari jet bike grew louder. Its pilot, sleek, cruel-eyed, and garbed in segmented armor etched with screaming faces, stalked him through the gloom, polar visor scanning the gantries. The Xeno's assassin paused, his optics catching the dull gleam of a Mark VII Astartes helm wedged behind a coolant drum. He raised his splinter rifle, but too late. Tunbald dropped like a thunderbolt from a support beam above, landing behind the rider with a crash of ceramite. His Seeks, a brutal blade with a warg's head pommel, punched through the backplate and found meat. With a savage twist, he wrenched the blade free and hurled the Drukhari from the saddle. The jet bike spiraled into the lower gantries, hissing and venting as it clattered against a vat of molten adamantium. The Revenant turned and strode to the helm he'd spotted earlier. It had fallen from his side when he climbed the forge's upper frame. Now, mud-caked and scorched, it looked back at him with dull eye lenses. He picked it up by the beaked rebreather, turning it once in his gauntleted hand. Then, in one fluid motion, he slotted it back over his head. The seals hissed. The world sharpened. Tunbald was ready. Below the fractured remains of his warship's engine block, Cabalite machinist Valeth strode through fire and twisted debris, his once jubilant mood darkened by the resilience of the defenders. The air crackled with ionized smoke, the scent of burnt promethium and warp taint filling his nostrils. His laughter had ceased. The foe was not breaking. Ahead, Corenzo, the silk-cloaked witch-sister, led her remaining guard with ruthless elegance, her body arcing through the air like a serpent of smoke and blades. At her command, Drukhari warriors lunged toward the shattered remnants of the grav tank, exchanging withering fire against Vanguard Skitarii lines dug in along broken ferrocrete barricades. Blue-hooded machine men volleyed with plasma casters, beams slicing through the oily mist. Cuthelm stood at their center, the Void Revenants' ghast-weird librarian, his power stave glowing with arcane frost. He hurled blasts of witchfire across the battlefield, igniting the Drukhari's cloaks and flaying flesh from chitinous armor. As Corenzo descended upon him, blades flashing with stored sorcery, he parried each strike with crackling force fields of glacial psychic energy. Sparks lit the gloom with each clash, chaos-born warpcraft versus the cold iron will of a disciplined librarian. High above, Valeth ascended the mangled arm of the fallen crane like a predator on high ground. Beneath him, the remnants of his ravager crackled with leaking energy, the forge's defenses now regrouping below. He leapt from the beamwork, landing with brutal grace beside the shattered grav tank. There, concealed behind the broken hull, knelt Calculus Logi Phexian, mechanical eyes dim, fingers trembling at his control manifold, mind locked deep within his machines. Valeth said nothing. He simply raised his twin-bladed glaive and sneered. Inside the vault far below, in the steaming tunnels of the great forge, Sorceress Azirshi led a band of surviving Drukhari back from the failed assault. The massive combat automata, 10-foot giants of ancient design, advanced with unrelenting menace, each swing of their claws tearing apart even the most agile of witch-born warriors. The walls of the passage were scorched with weapons discharge and burning circuitry, and still the machines pressed forward. Azirshi turned, hurling blackened psychic bolts into the fray, her laughter beginning to fray into fury. But the ward's fection had embedded into each machine responded. Null fields surged, scattering her warp energy like ash in the wind. One automaton reached her, arm raised for the killing blow. Then, halt. The machine froze. Its power claw hung inches from her helm. Confusion broke through her anger. It should have ended her, yet it paused. Why? Back above at the grav tank, Phexian's eyes opened, his systems rebooted. He had seen the moment through his machines, the warp-distorted readings, the halting claw. His subroutines surged, the control codes for the automaton had been diverted, manipulated. As he returned to reality, there stood Valeth above him, blade descending. Valeth brought the blade down, a killing blow that might have birthed great songs, had it landed. But before steel could taste blood, a shuriken cannon raked across his flank. He twisted, deflecting most with his warplate, though one screaming disc embedded itself in his arm with a hiss of scorched flesh. Snarling, he raised his blade again, just as Toonbald, riding low on his jet bike, aimed straight for him. "Fagward!" the warrior cried. The forward strut of the bike clipped a rock and spun away, the rear slamming into the muddy slope. But Toonbald had already leapt. He crashed into Valeth mid-air, the two slamming into the mud with a splash of blood and soil. They rolled, limbs tangled. Valeth recovered first, flinging up a hand to deflect the bolt rounds now slamming into the dirt around him. His power blade met a ricochet and crack! Shattered. Cursing, he drew a short Drukhari dueling blade and lunged, screaming fury. Toonbald met him with a drawn seeks of Skyfall forged black metal. The weapons collided, steel against soul blade, sparking like frost-bitten flame. The impact sent a jolt through them both, nerves screaming, hands numb. Both weapons fell. Toonbald struck first, a punch to the jaw, sending the Kabbalite sprawling. Valeth rose again, bloodied, laughing through broken teeth. "You fight with no honor," he spat, then raised his gauntlet and fired a wrist dart. The poison needle struck Toonbald's pauldron and skittered off. The warrior didn't flinch. "You fight like a coward," Toonbald growled, and drove a savage kick into Valeth's knee. There was a sickening snap. Valeth buckled, shrieking. A second kick swept his good leg from under him. He crumpled, dragging himself back, clutching at the mud. But as Toonbald advanced to finish it, a voice rang out. "Cuthelm!" Phexian shouted across the field. The battle was not yet done. Toonbald turned. The psyker Cuthelm was locked in combat with the twin sorceresses, warp fire burning the sky. One Corenzo pressed her advantage. Toonbald sprinted across the broken courtyard, mud splashing beneath his boots, scooping up his fallen Sikhs as he moved. Beside him, Cuthelm advanced through the haze, his breath ragged, power stave crackling with residual energy. The sorceress Corenzo stood amid a storm of dying light, her face twisted in cruel anticipation. Around them, Wigathane troopers fell one by one, skin flayed by unseen sorceries, bones snapping in unnatural arcs. Blades sang, bolts hissed, men screamed and died. Cuthelm gave a cry and surged forward, channeling the last of his strength into a brutal downward strike. Warp lightning flared about his stave like a comet's tail, but Corenzo's response was instant. She carved a rune into the air and spoke, and the earth split open beneath him with a deafening crack. Stone and soil sheared away. Cuthelm fell hard, wind knocked from his lungs. His chestplate cracked on a jagged root as he hit the ground. His helm's display flickered wildly, then died. Static flooded the Vox, and then a voice, soft, amused, and horribly familiar. "She's rather sweet, don't you think?" came Cenarion's voice, playful and taunting. "You should give her flowers, little seer. That's what you Wirthan do, isn't it? A pretty bloom to show your affection?" Cuthelm's lips curled into a snarl. "Begone, witch!" His eyes flared with sudden lucidity as the warp stabilized around him. He looked up and saw Corenzo, her blade descending toward his helm. But then a gust of air, thick with sulfur and perfume, sickly sweet and cloying. Corenzo hesitated, her eyes flicking to the source. A shadow passed over her features, confusion, even surprise. Cuthelm remembered. His hand darted to his belt. He tore loose a small, rough orb, an Ulgarith seed pod, heavy and dry, a relic of the old forest wars, filled with volatile flora and psionic decay. He hurled it at her feet. She cast a warding glyph, expecting fire. Instead, the pod struck the ground and detonated with a soft thump. A burst of petals, crimson and gold, surged outward in a blooming wave. Vines writhed from the earth like snakes, wrapping about Corenzo's leg, thorns biting into her armor. She shrieked and sliced at them with her dagger. But the moment bought Cuthelm precious time. He rolled, seized his power stave, and rose, panting, sparks dancing along the haft. Toonbald was already moving. The warrior fired into her flank, rounds punching into her kinetic shield, forcing her to turn. Corenzo spun, casting defensive wards in a flurry of motion, lashing back with a psionic scream, but too late. Cuthelm raised his stave. It crackled with warp light and grief, and he struck, sending a shockwave through her barrier. It fractured like glass, and from behind, Toonbald came on. No roar, no taunt, only a cold, final purpose. He plunged her own fallen poison blade deep into her side, the barbs slicing through silk steel. Corenzo gasped, her power faltering as the toxin spread instantly. Her limbs shuddered, eyes wide, lips parting in shock as she tried to cast, but nothing came. She fell, twisting, trailing crushed petals and severed vines in her wake. Cuthelm dropped to one knee, shoulders heaving. Toonbald stood over the body, silent save for the hum of his armor. The sorceress was dead, but the battle was not yet won. Corenzo's scream echoed and ended. The psychic pressure in the air collapsed with her death, leaving the world momentarily breathless. Her lifeless body lay tangled among curling vines and shattered sigils, blood soaking into the broken ground. Warp light flickered and died around her like guttering candles. Across the courtyard, Valeth was still crawling, his armor sparking and trailing blood. His good leg dragged uselessly behind him. He turned his head, eyes wide, lips trembling as he looked to the fallen sorceress. "Azirshi!" he rasped through broken teeth, voice hoarse with disbelief. She stood frozen, a vision of wrath and ruin. Her mask had cracked and now grief poured through. Her twin's death hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth moved, but no sound came, only a choking gasp. She dropped to her knees beside Corenzo's corpse, trembling hands brushing a blood-matted braid from her sister's face. "No," she whispered, "you weren't meant to die. Not like this, not here." The murder lust in her eyes returned tenfold, now hollow and wild. She rose, warp fire burning in her limbs, every ounce of power she had ready to be unleashed in blind, suicidal fury. She took a step toward Cuthelm and Toonbald, her blade igniting once more. But Valeth seized her arm, strength born of desperation. "We are out of time," he hissed, dragging her around to face him. "We will die here." She struggled, furious, but his grip held. There is time for vengeance. Later, this was never the true attack. This was a distraction, Azirshi, a feint, and now we burn for it. Around them, the walls trembled, then shattered. The Ironsid wagon smashed through in a thunder of steel and flame. Wigathan's stormtroopers poured in, their armor blackened with soot, visors glowing, las rifles raised in disciplined volleys. Shields slammed into Drukhari skirmishers, hammers crushed bone, bolt fire tore through witch flesh. And then came Deacon Absalon, robes singed, carrying a battered chainsword in one hand and a broken Aquila in the other. He led a column of Frateris militia, drawn from forge workers, miners, and ash scavengers. They came like a tide, poorly armed but zealous, filling the breach with holy fire and righteous fury. "For NihtWyrtha," they roared. "For the Queen, for the throne!" The Kabbalite line crumpled. The elite warriors who had laughed in the face of death were suddenly overwhelmed. They had never expected such resistance, certainly not from vermin in tattered uniforms and rusted weapons. But the humans did not break. They came on, screaming hymns, striking down even the fleeing. Valeth's heart sank. The mission was ashes. Their real target, forgotten. Carenzo was gone, and Azirshi, her face twisted in silent grief, was a storm about to die in place. We die for nothing. He felt it, a rare thing among his kind. Fear, and then a roar overhead. A jet bike screamed past, trailing smoke. Hooked chains snapped down, catching them both. The air cracked as the repulsors surged. In an instant, Valeth and Azirshi were yanked skyward, limp in the grasp of barbed lifelines. Azirshi looked back once, lips trembling, watching her sister's body disappear in the swirl of battle smoke. They vanished over the dark waters, fleeing into the night, leaving the great forge blazing and the valley below lit with war. Cuthhelm stood at the edge of the cliff, firelight from the forge casting long shadows across his armor. The wind whipped his tabard, carrying with it the scent of scorched metal and blood. Below, the forge still burned, though the worst had passed. Toonbald stepped up beside him, slamming a fresh magazine into his bolter with a practiced click. He said nothing. On the other side, Calculus Logifexian emerged, his robes scorched and servos twitching from stress. He gazed down at the smoldering complex, his augmetic eye pulsing in the gloom. Fexian processed the reports cascading through his neural ports with methodical precision. His vault defenses had held. The enemy had failed to penetrate the lower sanctums. Tiberius had been wrong. He allowed himself that victory, but only for a moment. The damage to the great forge, the lives lost. He had placed the defense of the Void Revenants, STC cores above the surface-level infrastructure. He'd made a calculated choice, and now the fire in the upper levels whispered a quiet accusation. "The target was the forge," Fexian said flatly, his internal vox threads flaring with data traffic. "The upper works are damaged, but the vaults remain unbreached. We are still in the fight." Without turning, he directed fire suppression units, Medicae servitors, and cogitator-linked rescue parties through silent commands, relaying orders with the flick of a thought. Then came Deacon Absalon, emerging from the gloom with soot-streaked robes and a makeshift blade in hand. Behind him, the ragged line of Frateris militia, barely 10 minutes raised, worked tirelessly, extinguishing fires, dragging wounded, and giving last rites where they could. "Wounded to the Holmbiorg," he shouted over his shoulder. "Brother Elfstan awaits." He joined the others at the overlook, panting. "Bad business. The Wizard Academia took a direct hit. Still waiting for full reports. Sorry it took so long. We had to detour. The main road to Wizard has a 10-foot crater. I think they were aiming for the chapel, but the void shielding activated just in time. My apology." Cuthhelm shook his head, eyes still fixed on the forge. He stood silent, the warmth of the forge fire on his armor doing little to thaw the unease rising in his gut. Once again the warp had answered. That voice, Cenarion's voice, had returned when he was weakest, whispering through the static like a mocking friend. The Olgarith pod had worked, yes, but was that instinct, or manipulation? He did not speak of it, not yet, not while the air still stank of blood and ash. "No apology needed, Deacon. Your aid is always gladly accepted." Deacon Absalon stood, robes still singed from the chapel, his voice hoarse from smoke and prayer. He had been inside when the first salvo struck. By the throne's grace and Tiberius's stubbornness, the void shield had just been activated before the second. He owed his life to the Wazir Chapel's upgrade. a decision made not from faith, but cost-saving. The place had been destroyed twice before. Tiberius had simply grown tired of rebuilding it. He thought of the personal servitor he'd left behind in Suthi Hill, an old gift from Voratrix. He doubted she would have left it if she didn't expect him to keep it with him. It had been a mistake, one he would not repeat. Fexen inclined his head. "We were lucky you were nearby." Toonbald spoke then, his voice low. He rested a gauntlet on his bolter. He should have seen this coming. The pieces had been there, Valeth's patterns, the silence from Elfscathia, the unusual movement of void traffic. He should have acted. Now Wulfgar was unaccounted for, the forge was half in ruin, and the enemy had escaped. The guilt sat deep in his chest, unspoken but sharp. "I'm not sure it was luck." Absalon frowned. "Meaning? Surely the forge was their target?" Toonbald's eyes narrowed. "That was Kabbalite machinist Valeth down there, the architect of Elfscathia. I've seen the NihtWyrtha's reports. He's not the kind to waste himself on a diversion. And if he was here, where was Void Reaver?" Cuthhelm spoke, voice taut. "And that sorceress we fought, it wasn't Eilith. She resembled her, yes, but it wasn't her. And the other one, they looked like twins." Fexen gave a slow nod. "There were whispers early in the Arcana Inclusium campaigns that Eilith had 3 daughters, the eldest, Azeranaza, and twin sisters, Karenzo and Azirshi. I think we just killed one." They stood in silence a moment, the implications settling in like cold ash. "So if this wasn't the main attack," Cuthhelm said grimly, "then where is it?" Tunbald raised a hand to his helm, keying the vox. "Raise Wulfgar. Get a sitrep from the train." There was only static. Seconds passed. He lowered his hand, jaw tight. "The train is not responding." They all looked up toward the hangar bay, where smoke still belched into the sky, thick and oily. "We need transport," Toonbald said. Absalon cleared his throat. "The Ministorum may be of service." They all turned to stare at him. He held up both hands defensively. "No, we don't have transports officially, but Inquisitor Malinovska visited frequently in the old days, and he left his ground car in our care, ecclesiarchal property, technically." The 3 stared. "You have the ident chip?" Cuthhelm asked, arching a brow. Absalon blinked, then fumbled in his robes, retrieving a worn leather pouch. "Well, yes, of course, he entrusted it to us." Cuthhelm nodded slowly, deadpan. "Then I suggest you go start the engine.